It's my pleasure to introduce our next presenter of session one, Sedona Jolly, a junior from Case Western Reserve University who will be discussing I am the law and I speak for the trees, the impact of rights of nature legislation on local air quality. Sedona, all you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sedona Jolly. I am a third year at Case Western Reserve University, and today I'm going to be talking with you all about rights of nature and their potential impacts on air quality. So this is a project that my capstone partner, Sierra Williams, and I have been working on only for the past semester, and I plan on continuing this project into the fall. So I really am looking forward to hearing your questions and getting your feedback. Feel free to interrupt me while I'm giving the presentation, because the whole purpose of this is I want to know what are some potential directions that we could take this, what are some potential drawbacks that can be addressed over the summer and into the fall. So without further ado, let's talk about what rights of nature are. So this is a fairly new concept, at least in the Western world, but it's this idea that nature, land, ecosystems, both the living and non-living parts of the ecosystem have inherent rights. Now this is, again, a rather new idea, but many places starting in the early 2000s around the world have brought these laws into being at the local level, at the national level. As you can see, Ecuador was the first country to actually implement rights of nature in their constitution, whereas Tamaulipas, which we'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide, was the first place in the world, and it was a local city in the United States to give nature rights in the law. So what this means is, similar to how corporations are able to be represented in court as people, in some places similar rights have been extended to forests, rivers, trees, ecosystems, and other natural entities. So to make this a little bit more concrete, since I'm not sure how many of you all are familiar with rights of nature, this is an example of Tamaulipas. This was a city about 100 miles east of Philadelphia, and it was a former mining town, and after the mining industry declined, there were these huge pits, as you can see in red, that were left by what were former coal mines. So the people that owned these pits ended up selling them out so that people can put fly ash and sewage into them. And this is technically legal because sewage sludge can be used typically in small quantities as fertilizer for farmers. But in these large quantities, people in Tamaulipas were starting to notice various health effects. And there wasn't much that they could do given the established legal structure to protect themselves from this. Many people from this town don't have the resources, one, for health insurance to deal with the negative health effects that they were noticing, and two, to be able to potentially sue the companies behind this on their own to improve harm to themselves as an individual. So they enacted rights of nature, which would mean that in this city, for particular harm could be shown to have been done to the environment, which makes it, in this way, a little bit easier to prove legally. So there's a couple more examples, but if you want to chat more after this, just for time's sake, I'll skip them a little bit. But I do want to mention a bit about Ohio, because Ohio is actually one of the places where a lot of cities have started to try to pass these bills, most notably Toledo, after the huge algae bloom in Lake Erie, wanted to declare rights of nature for Lake Erie. However, that was quickly shut down by the state of Ohio, and there's a couple other cities, and eventually it got so annoying that Ohio was like, no more of these bills, no more of this. But I don't think that this is necessarily because Ohio hates the environment. Ohio is just a little bit skeptical because as of late, there really isn't much evidence that these bills work to do what they're intended to do, which is to protect the environment and protect the health of the people that rely upon it. And so it makes sense to be just a little bit skeptical until you have some empirical research behind it. So what there exists right now, there's a lot of stuff in philosophy, there's a lot of stuff in law, and there's just not much empirical work and very scarce literature in economics on this topic overall. But there are some papers that do suggest that laws at the local level could potentially impact environmental outcomes, and there is some theory that would suggest that giving rights to an entity, like, say, a river, might increase the risk of a lawsuit, or assigning appropriate property rights to nature to own themselves might potentially reduce some of the negative externalities in the production process of many firms. So our main question, again, to try to hopefully to answer is do these bills work? There wasn't really an expansive data set until this fall that included all of the places in the world where rights of nature have been passed. So this is a really cool opportunity for my partner and I to be able to get in the weeds and take a look at these bills. So we find in the end that there is about a 3 percentage point increase in the share of good air quality days in any given year following the passage of one of these bills. This equates to about just over a week of additional good air quality days, and this is statistically significant at the 10% level. So why air quality? It seems like a little bit of a strange measure, but the main reason is there's 3 reasons for that. One, data. It's publicly available from the EPA for every single county in the United States from 2000 to 2020, 2022 actually. As well as air quality is a really strong indicator for public health. About 200,000 deaths annually in the United States are associated with poor air quality. And lastly, air quality is a good measure of environmental health because the environment, again, is an ecosystem. So air quality is correlated with water quality, which is correlated with the land quality, and it's an overall good measure for that. So here's a little bit more about air quality measures. Again, we could chat more about the specifics of this afterwards if you'd like. But what does our data look like? So we ended up gathering data from the EPA, from this data set that was published in the fall by Putzer et al., and the ACS data to get data on like unemployment and it's other things about each of the states. And we're only looking at states where air quality was passed. So our unit of observation is going to be a county in a given year. And what we're going to do, sorry, I'll talk about that. I want to explain on this slide instead, is going to be a county in a given year. And so there's about 636 counties in our data set, and of those counties, 76 of those passed these bills. And about 15% of the time, so 15% of our observations, these laws are on or the laws have passed. And so when we, in order to find this effect, we end up employing a couple of econometric methods, but most notably we use a Callaway-Santa Ana staggered difference in difference model, which means that we're going to be looking at this. We're going to be looking at the difference in differences in from a bunch of different comparisons in order to find the average effect for any given law passed in any given year. What would we expect the difference to be following that? This is a binary, so some places might have passed more than one law, but we're just looking at, okay, is there a law that is on, is not yet, or never passed? We're going to compare this law passed group to this law never passed group. Okay, so some evidence to suggest that we would need to use slightly more advanced econometric methods than a standard regression is this graph. So in the lower line are rights of our treatment group. As you see, that would be like the circle on the left. So these are places that eventually pass rights of nature bills. And on average, these places already have far lower air quality than places that did not pass these bills. I think this might kind of come as a surprise. This definitely came as a surprise to me because I figured these bills might be more common in places that are really liberal and already really care a lot about the environment, but it seems to be the opposite, which was kind of surprising. And in the years following the passage of the first Rights of Nature bill in 2006, this gap between our treatment and control group, in quotation marks, seems to be getting smaller. So we want to know if the passage of these Rights of Nature bills can explain this shrink in the gap between places that did not pass the bills and places that did. And so, again, our simple OLS regression and our multivariate regression suggest the opposite, that being in a place that has rights of nature actually reduces your air quality, but this is because on average places that pass these bills have lower air quality to begin with and don't end up surpassing their peers. However, we employ this difference in difference model where we are going to take a look at, for any given year, we're going to say this is the year that the bill is passed, and we're going to compare the difference between the average of the time prior to the bill passing and the time following the bill passing between the groups that end up passing the bill and the groups that don't, to see if there is a difference in that second period for any group for every single year passed. And we also look at the dynamic effects for the changes over time. So is this an immediate effect? I don't know about you, but I wouldn't expect
Sorry, Sedona,
as soon
10
as
minutes is up.
Okay. Is it okay if I continue for like 3 more minutes? Just a little bit. I have some really cool graphs I want to show, and I think they're really important. Is that okay? Yay! Okay. So again, this is our average treatment effect that I mentioned before. So this is our event studies of the dynamic effects. So like I mentioned, you probably wouldn't expect to see you pass a bill, all of a sudden, boom, instantly air quality is better, but it does seem to be increasing over time. So in the pre-treatment period, on average, you have about equal data points above and below 0, whereas in the post-treatment period, all of the data points are above 0. And in addition, this is an example of each of the groups. So for every single year that a Rights of Nature bill was passed, we calculated the difference in difference effect of what is the expected change in air quality in the post-treatment period for bills passed in this year, and the majority of the time this is a positive effect, and the average is, again, around a 3 percentage point increase. So there's a bunch of problems, and I'll chat with you about those problems if you want to chat about the problems later. So one of them is, again, spillover effects, air quality. Air is everywhere, so we hope that the difference in difference might control for some of the general air quality trends in the state, but again, if you're comparing to neighbors, what one county does is going to affect another county. There might be potential limited variable bias with different states passing different bills that we'd have to control for in the future, as well as some certain limitations in the data. We would much prefer to have data at the city level, but we could only find data at the county level, as well as potential collider bias with certain counties being overrepresented in terms of the number of data points that we have, and these are generally places that have larger populations, so more rural areas. We wouldn't have as many data points on their air quality. Now, future research. So because this is the first time that this data has even been out there, the first time that there's been an empirical analysis looking at the effect of these bills, there is a whole lot that can be done beyond this. So looking at different outcomes, like what about water quality? What about ground quality? What about species, endangered species? What about looking at like specific molecules in the air quality that, like, for PM 2.5s, different treatment comparison groups. What about comparing groups that almost passed the bill and then didn't? What about this cost-benefit analysis? This is a huge part that's missing from my presentation, which is, well, okay, great, it has an effect, but is it worth it? You know, is it worth it? Is it worth it for the potential risk for the Ohioan farmers? Is it worth it? Maybe industries decide that they don't want to work there, and it causes people's wages to decrease. So how can we figure out whether or not these bills are worth the cost? And better controls. I would love to see to get some controls on the political orientation of the places, as well as altitude, forest fires, stuff like that, to try to make sure that our results are more statistically robust. But in all, this preliminary findings are fairly positive. They don't I wouldn't say that they're like, oh yes, this is the be-all end-all solution to climate change and conservation work, but I would say that it does suggest that there is potential for these bills, but there is definitely a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of understanding what specific kinds of bills and what places and at what times, what applications of them actually work, for whom and at what cost. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I would be happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Sedona. I open the floor to our discussant.
Yeah, thank you, Sedona, for presenting this amazing paper in the field of public economics and law. And I think that your presentation was great, and that you really noticed how passionate you are about this subject. So yeah, this all sounds great. I'll keep it short, sort of, because in the interest of time, I'll just keep my comments short. So. Your research question was whether passing of rights of nature legislation had an effect on, or has an effect on air quality. And so these rights of nature laws are, from what I understand, laws that give natural bodies such as forests and rivers specific rights that sort of go above and beyond their usual protection in the law as they are currently. And they've been very controversial in the past, as you highlighted in your paper. Some argued that rights of nature laws are necessary to protect nature, and some argued the contrary, that they aren't necessary, that current protection is enough, and that maybe even because in other cases in which groups that needed protection weren't able to be protected by laws passing, that rights of nature laws would be ineffective anyways. And so you used a difference in differences model to check if there is a statistically significant effect of the passing of rights of nature laws on air quality. And while there's some sort of conflicting evidence, you do point out that the preliminary evidence points in the direction that there actually is an effective and a significant effect. And so I think that your paper is really unique. I mean, as you said, there's not been much literature at all, especially in the field of economics. And I think that this research topic is extremely important because, as you highlighted in your paper, a lot of people die every year because of bad air quality. So that's definitely something that we as a society have to fix in the future. And so maybe these rights of nature could be one way in which we could increase air quality. And I think that you have some good theoretical background also in the paper. You highlighted that that externalities could be at play here, but I think that you could have some more discussion on the theoretical considerations. And what comes to mind to me first is that this might be comparable to a sort of Pigouvian tax, these rights of nature laws. But I think that in general, you should really continue with this research topic, and you really notice that you're really passionate about this topic. So that's great, and I think those are all of my comments. I tried to keep it short. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Floor is open for Q&As.
Yes.
So when you began, I thought you were going to discuss utility functions for trees, something about what trees want, and all I heard is what humans want. You probably don't know this, but I am a tree. I want more greenhouse gases. CO2 is a great fertilizer for me. You're going to give it to me?
That is a really great question. So that is one of the main debates in the sort of legal literature is like, well, how can people speak on behalf of the trees? Like, how can people speak on behalf of the environment? And I think that what it comes down to is it's less about like a specific animal within the ecosystem and more about the ecosystem as a whole and the functioning of the system as a whole. And so a lot of times what this looks like, especially in indigenous areas, is you might have a group of people that understand the complex interrelationships between the air, the earth, the species of the environment. So if the tree, as an individual tree, really, really, really wants more CO2, like loves it, just like we as people, we really, 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 really want to keep using fossil fuels because it's so efficient, so convenient for us. But is that necessarily the best thing for the entire ecosystem? And so it's about it's about looking at more of the rights of these systems as opposed to individuals, which is, I think, what characterizes rights of nature, makes it a little bit different from, say, like animal rights. Yes. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I understand what you, but take a point of methodological individualism, I don't know, how would you ever do these trade-offs between different aspects of, and CO2 is, if I'm correct, a actual fertilizer. And so to me, it's very reasonable, not for that trait, but I'm confident there's a lot of forms of life that would rather have a different atmosphere than we currently have. I mean, everything you're saying is still from a very human, from our perspective. I'm just trying to figure out, how do you get to nature's perspective without us imposing, without you imposing what you would like to see?
Yeah. So a lot of different places have taken different approaches to this. So I think a good example might be the Maori people in New Zealand. So they declared rights of nature for a historic river that is really important to the indigenous people that have lived there for generations. And so in order to make sure that they are, and so they basically declare the rights of this river. This river is now a person in New Zealand. And what they do is they have a council combined of both people, like New Zealanders, people of New Zealand, like general citizens, as well as Maori people, to come together to be able to evaluate cases and to evaluate what is actually in the interest of the river. And so when it comes to being like, okay, there's also, yes, CO2 is one measure of one thing that trees also like, but there's many, many, many other measures in the environment of things that can change over time that might make things favorable or unfavorable. So as much as CO2 is great, oh yes, breath of fresh air, producing lots of oxygen. At the same time, you're going to have rising temperatures, which is going to mean that diseases are going to be more widespread, which means that, well, more trees, more plants, more animals are going to get diseases, more people are going to get diseases, which ultimately will not benefit them. So I think definitely more work needs to be done in order to understand these competing effects. And I think that definitely collaboration with ecologists who are much more deeply rooted in the understanding of these interrelationships is necessary in order to understand, well, what does nature want, and how could we accurately represent this in court by sort of a proxy, similar to how children can be represented in court by their parents, something like that. Yeah. Any more questions? Any more questions?
Hey, Sedona.
Yeah. Are we out of time? Oh, we're out of time.
Are we out of time?
No. Oh, wait, someone's asking me a question.
Yes, over here.
Oh,
sorry.
Oh, yes.
Hi, my name is Jason. I'm a RA here at the bank. I wanted to ask a question a little bit about the idea of the causal mechanism of these laws of nature, like opposed to some sort of law that sets a limit on pollution or a tax on pollution, et cetera. Essentially, like, do you have a sense of how binding these laws actually are? I'm assuming, I guess asking rather, in what cases would you actually see that causal mechanism mediated? Like, does there need to be some sort of court case of some sort of development that's blocked, or plan to expand a business or build a plant, et cetera, that's blocked because of the law? If so, do you have that data available? Is that something you've thought about implementing?
Yes, so there's, actually I just found one yesterday. So for Tamaqua, one of the things that they were looking at was fly ash that was being dumped, which gets into the air, gets into your lungs, it's pretty bad. And so they were able to sue companies and fine them. In other places like the Ojibwe the White Earth Clan of the Ojibwe Nation in Wisconsin, they are actually in an active legal battle since they declared rights of nature for wild rice with a company that wants to build a pipeline through the reservation. So it doesn't, I'm not going to say it necessarily is stopping it, but it's definitely making it a little bit harder to go through. So those are some examples, and there are other examples, mostly at the national level in terms of big companies. So, but that is a really important question, which is, okay, does this work at the local level? Are people actually going to be able to enforce this, and are people enforcing this? And so that's one of the things that I definitely would want to see in the future, is a better understanding of, okay, these laws might work, but do they work in what circumstances? Does it only work if you have if it's like the Constitution says it, or does there need to be more done there? But yeah, that's a really, really, really great question.
Hi. My question was, how do you plan on, in the future even, kind of getting this confounding variable between just regulations from the EPA in general on what corporations can and can't do to the environment versus these rights of natures? Like, do you think that the rights of natures are actually having this impact, or if it's just increased regulations?
So that is a really good question. And I think that more robust econometric methods will be able to answer that question. So right now, some ideas that I have would be to, first of all, only compare within states. So if different states are enacting different policies, that might make things different. So if you have a lot of rights of nature bills that are passed in Pennsylvania, but Pennsylvania also at the same time is passing more strict regulations on air quality, that is something that we would have to account for, and we could account for by doing perhaps like instead of saying, oh, we're going to do the average of all of these states, we could impose state fixed effects, or we could exclusively do where we could use matching, like a propensity score matching to see, okay, well, let's match this county with another county that is similar to it on a bunch of other measures that would suggest that this one would also pass a bill eventually. So then we could do that one-to-one matching to see if maybe it is the bill. In terms of national laws, I think that gets a little bit more tricky, where you have, if the EPA is enacting a lot of laws that are going to try to improve air quality standards overall, it is likely that those might impact certain places, like the ones with lower air quality already, more than places that have higher air quality. So what I would do for that is I would say using different measures of the environment, environmental health, as well as looking at particular particles in the air as opposed to the general air quality index. Because then you can see, like, oh, if it's targeting this particle, maybe a different one. Yes, and I am out of time. But thank you all so much for your questions. Thank you all so much for your feedback, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Sedona.